call is now being recorded.
All right. So in the last class, we were looking at what is known as a pairwise independent hash family, right? And our goal was to use it to do randomness efficient probability amplification. Right? We saw these one-sided error algorithms, and we said that we can amplify the success probability by repeating the algorithms, repeating the algorithm with independent random strings. And then we want to say that we can still achieve probability amplification by not using independent random strings, but by using pairwise independent random strings, right? And to that end, we defined what is known as a pairwise independent hash family. Rather, we saw construction of a pairwise independent hash family. And let's just recall the definition once. Right. So what you're saying is that a set of functions h script h, which contains functions h from a domain D to a range R, right, is said to be a pairwise independent hash family. If the following holds, right? So if for every x1 not equal to x2 in the domain and y1 and y2 in the range, right, the probability when you sample a function h uniformly at random from the family hash family, h of x1 is equal to y1 and h of x2 is equal to y2, right? This is as though they are completely random, correct? This is the definition of a pairwise independent hash family. Um just a few things to note at this point, right? So if you look at uh, the set of all functions, okay, you wanted to see that, okay. So what exactly do you want to know? Why do you want irreducible polynomials? Is that what you want to know? Yeah. So the reason you want to find irreducible polynomials is because, so if we said that typically we might not be able to find primes, right? So we said that there is this problem of finding a prime which is greater than 2 power n, which we don't know how to do efficiently, right? And then what we observed was that it was not exactly the prime that was doing, that we are actually using to construct the pairwise independent hash family, but rather the fact that the underlying structure, the algebraic structure that we are working with, is a finite field. As long as that underlying algebraic structure is a finite field, all our constructions will go through. So our goal is to look at finite fields rather than just the set ZP. And to construct, so the theorem here says that for every prime P and every integer R, there is one and only one finite field of cardinality P power R up to isomorphism, right? And how is that finite field constructed? Such a finite field constructed, it is constructed as follows. You take if you want to construct the finite field GFR, right, the Galois field of cardinality P power R, what you do is you look at the set, that set is basically the set of all degree R polynomials over the field FP or ZP, where addition and multiplication is performed modulo an irreducible polynomial of degree R in GFP, right? So for instance, here GF4, which is basically GF2 square, what you do is you find an irreducible polynomial of degree 2 over GF2, which is x square plus x plus 1, right? Now you look at all polynomials of degree at most 2, uh, and you do addition and multiplication modulo this polynomial. That will be your algebraic structure. That will be your finite field of cardinality 4. Right? And typically, similarly, when you are working with, you want to construct a finite field of GF2 power n, what you do is you find an irreducible polynomial of degree n over F2, and then you look at all polynomials of degree at most n in over F2, and you do addition and multiplication modulo this irreducible polynomial, this fixed irreducible polynomial. Right? And irrespective of which irreducible polynomial you choose, the field will be the same up to isomorphism. Right? Does that answer your question, Sarthak? So why do we need irreducibility? Well, if you don't have irreducibility, then what can happen is that inverses, multiplicative inverses will not be there. You'll be able to get a zero polynomial and all by multiplying two elements in the field and so on, right? So irreducibility is needed there. Yeah. Any other questions regarding this part? And the nice thing is that all of this can be done efficiently, right? If you give me n, I can, there are explicit irreducible polynomials of degree n in GF2. You can easily get that, right? That makes the whole thing very efficient. The construction, it makes the construction very efficient. Okay. Any other questions regarding this part? Okay, so then let's get back here, right? Okay, so we were looking at this definition of these pairwise independent hash family, right? So trivially, you can say that the set of all functions from D to R, this is a this set is basically a pairwise independent hash family. If you look at all functions, right? Because if you think about it, when you say you choose a random function from D to R, well, it's like assigning random values to each point in D, and therefore this will definitely be a pairwise independent hash family, right? So what makes our construction nice, right, or useful for algorithm design is the fact that uh, our construction using finite fields gives a small family H, right? It's a smaller family. It's not the set of all functions, but a subset of functions. But then it does not have full independence. If you look at the set of all functions, then they are not just pairwise independent; they are completely independent. But what we do is we find a smaller family, but we lose full independence, but we have pairwise independence still, and that is all that is needed for our construction, right? In particular, what we need is a pairwise independent hash family H for functions H from 0, 1 to the log k to 0, 1 to the n, right? And to do this, what you do is you have to, how do you randomly sample? So you need to say how to randomly sample an element from this set, right? Random sampling from H. Right? What you need is, so how did we say what is H? The way it was defined, it is something like H of X is nothing but A times X plus B, right? Where we want to randomly sample A and B, right? And A and B are elements of this finite field G of 2 power n, right? So they are basically polynomials, right? And if you take a string A in 0, 1 to the n, right? Say this string is written as A1, A2 up till AN, right? This corresponds to a polynomial, which is summation AI, if I say A0 to n minus 1, this is AI x power I, right? So these strings correspond to these polynomials, and these multiplication and addition, right? They are performed in GF2 power n, right? So now what we do is we have this very nice family, which is a pairwise independent hash family, and we can do these operations. So how do you sample? So now what do we do? So what is our goal? Our goal is to basically do the following. Our original probability amplification was the following. Right? Our original probability amplification was you had an algorithm A, you repeat A k times with independent random strings. Correct? This is what you did. This is equivalent to saying you randomly sample h from 0 1 to the log k to 0 1 to the n from the set of all functions from 0 1 to the log k to 0 1 to the n, right? This is equivalent. Correct? What we're doing now, the new amplification that we are going to do is the following. You repeat A k times as follows. Sample h from the pairwise independent hash family. Use the functions hx1, hx2, and so on till hxk as the k random strings. Right? So what we're doing is instead of sampling a random function and then, so the repeating k times with independent random bits is like sampling a random function from the set of all functions. Whereas now what you do is you sample a function from the pairwise independent hash family. Then you evaluate that function on every input. So there are k different inputs, right? The input length is log k, so there are k different inputs. Evaluate it on all the k different inputs and use those strings as inputs to your random strings for your algorithm. Right? And what we want to do is to analyze this process here. Right? What can you say about this process here? Is this clear? Any questions regarding this? Any clarifications needed? Right? So let's see how we will analyze this, right? And to do this, let's define. So you have these evaluation of these are the random strings where h is sampled uniformly at random from the hash family capital H, right? These are n-bit strings. Right? So let's look at this random variable, which I say is xi, which is 1 if the algorithm A on the random string h of x1 say evaluates to 0 and it is 0 otherwise. Okay. Sorry, xi evaluates to 0 and to 0 otherwise. So it's an indicator random variable that basically captures whether the algorithm is saying yes or no. In this case, it is saying no, whether it is saying no. Okay. So if you recall our the way in which the algorithms that we saw, we said that if all of them say no, you want to you will say no. If at least one of them says yes, then you will say yes. Right? That was the way in which we did it, and we want to analyze that in this new setting where we have pairwise independent random variables, pairwise independent random variables. Okay, and xi's are, so that is just what I said. Xi's are pairwise independent. Since H is a pairwise independent hash family. Right? That specific hash family that we saw, right? We're using that. And what are we going to do, right? We are going to see the following. Let's look at this random variable x, which is summation xi, where I goes from 1 to k, right? And so let me just see, let us, what is that we want. So if at least one of them says a no, we are going to say a no. Okay, so algorithm A is such that if at least one of them says a no, we will say a no. Otherwise, if everything says a yes, we will say yes, right? For instance, let's look at say the identity testing problem. What did we say? We'll evaluate it on a set of inputs, right? If all of them say that it is identically 0, then we say it is identically 0. If at least one of them says that it is not identically 0, we will say it is not identically 0. Okay, so that's what in the way in which we had done. So what we're going to do is look at this random variable x, and we are interested in the event. We are interested in the event that x is equal to 0, right? Which is equivalent to saying that A returns 1 in every run. Correct? This is what we are interested in. We need to bound this probability, right? So we're going to use the fact that xi's are pairwise independent, right? So what is expectation of xi? Expectation of x, it is nothing but k times expectation of xi, right? And xi is the probability that A is going to give us 0, right? Let's assume that it is greater than half for now. It doesn't matter. It can be any p, and the algorithm, I mean, the analysis will change a little bit, but it doesn't matter. Let's assume that it is at least half, in which case this expectation is at least k over 2, right? And then what do we know? Then we just use the Chebyshev's inequality. So what we are interested in is this probability that x is equal to 0, right? Which you can say is bounded by the probability that x minus expectation of x is greater than or equal to k over 2, right? If this event happens, then definitely x will be this event x equal to 0 is contained inside this larger event, right? So it's sufficient to bound this probability of this larger event. That is what we are going to do, right? Because if x is 0, you know that E of x is greater than k over 2, and then therefore this event happens. But if x is not 0, also this event can happen. But let's just bound the probability of this larger event here, and that should be sufficient to bound the probability that x is equal to 0, right? So we are going to bound this. This is in the form where you can apply Chernoff bound, right? So this is nothing but at most 4 times variance of x divided by k squared, right? And what is variance of x? This is where we use the independence, right? This is where we use the independence to say that this is k times variance of xi, right? And variance of xi is at most half, right? That we know. So this is at most k over 2. So k over 4, it's at most 1/4 that we saw last time, right? So this is at most k over 4, and this is at most 1 over k. Correct? So therefore, the fact that you will always fail, right, is bounded by 1 over k, which is slightly worse off. So if you recall our analysis before, when you had independent random strings, for every run, for each of the k runs, what you had was that this probability, we didn't write it this way, but what we said was this probability is at most 1 over 2 power k. Okay, so it has reduced from 1 over 2 power k to 1 over k, right? The probability guarantee has reduced slightly, but then you are using much fewer number of random bits, right? Because how many random bits do you actually require? You just need the random bits. So the number of random bits required, right? Number of random bits required is equal to the number of bits necessary to represent a function h small h in the hash family. How many bits do you need for that? How many bits do you need to represent a function in capital H? This will be, you will need so many bits to sample, right? How many bits will you need? How many bits do you need to represent a function in capital H? Log k, not really log k, right? Because you want to work, so you're working in the field gf2 power n, right?
Like you need n bits, right?
You need 2n bits, yeah, order n bits. You need, so if you recall the construction, what did we need? We needed the a and b, right? So we needed the a and b. These are the two things that we need to represent the function, the a here and the b here. And both of them are elements from 2 power n, gf2 power n. What is an element in gf2 power n? It is just a polynomial of degree at most n, which is just an n-bit string. So you need two n-bit strings. So you sample two n-bit strings, and then you just reuse it, right? So you're only sample once. To get h, you sample once two n-bit strings. After that, you evaluate h on, so that defines h. Then you evaluate h on all the inputs, 0, 1 to the log k. There are k such things. You evaluate all of them, and you use those strings as inputs to your random strings for your algorithm, right? So the number of random bits required is now something like 2n, right? So it has gone down from n times k to 2n, but your probability, the error probability has gone up from 1 over 2 power k to 1 over k, right? So it's a sort of trade-off that you have. You're using much less random bits, but then you are getting a lot more error, right? And the analysis is, you're just using Chebyshev's inequality because of the fact that the way in which you're constructing these random variables, they are going to be pairwise independent, right? Is this clear, what we have just said? Any questions regarding this? Any questions? Okay, so then so we'll see more of so what inequality to use where depends on the situation, and what sort of guarantee that you need. And Markov is not useful in many places, but it is useful sometimes in places that you don't actually, in the first shot you might think you'll need something much more complicated, but Markov is much easier to use because it is applicable to all random variables. Chebyshev is useful, but you need to know a little more about the random variable. You need to know what is its variance and so on, right? What you're going to see next is a set of class of bounds which is applicable, which are very strong bounds when it about concentration of the random variable around the expectation, but then it requires more assumptions, more structure on the random variables, right? So these are called what are known as Chernoff-Hovding bounds. These are useful in a lot of places, right? But these are by no means the strongest bounds, right? But it's useful in a lot of different places. And we'll see Chernoff bounds, and then we will look at some applications, and then so that is sort of like the first module, and then we'll move from there. Right? Okay. So now, once again, let's start with these random variables x1. Let's say you have n random variables, right? x1 to xn. They are independent. These random variables are independent. Okay? And assume that so independent and they are indicator random variables. Okay. Okay. Such that the probability for xi is equal to 1 is say pi. Okay, you have such n random variables. They are independent. They are indicator random variables, right? Now we're going to look at the sum of these random variables, right? X, which is the sum of independent random variables, Bernoulli random variables, right? Each with parameter pi. Now the expectation of this random variable, expectation of x, is summation pi, right? And what we're going, Chernoff-Hofding bounds gives you a bound for the probability that x is concentrated around its expectation, right? So this quantity here is what we are going to compute, right? It tells you, so it's very similar. So it's like Chebyshev's inequality, right? All concentration inequalities look very similar to this, right? It says you have a random variable x, you have some expectation. What is the probability that x is going to deviate from the expectation, right? And if you notice, the Markov bound is one-sided and it is very weak. Chebyshev is slightly stronger. Still, it is not very strong in the sense that you need to know the variance, and even then, the bound will still be something like an inverse polynomial. Chernoff is going to give you a much stronger bound, something like an inverse exponential bound. But then it requires the additional assumptions on. It requires that these random variables are independent and are independent. Okay? It will also work when these random variables are slightly dependent. We will see that maybe in some of the exercises or problem sets, right? So we'll see a brief outline of how we are going to prove such a statement. Okay, we will not see the full proof. We'll see a brief idea of how the proof goes. The reason I don't want to do the whole proof is that it is after a while it's a lot more technical and you have to do a lot of basic calculus and manipulations and approximations. But then the idea involved in proving this is useful in many different places, right? So you will see when you actually read some paper or books, you will see the term Chernoff-like bounds, Chernoff-type bounds, Chernoff-Hofding bounds applied in a variety of different situations, right? The reason is that there are very similar looking bounds that is applied in different situations. And when you actually develop an algorithm and try to analyze it, at some point you might yourself have to prove some such bound, rather than there might not be a textbook bound that you can use, but then you might actually have to go around trying to prove such a Chernoff-Hofding bound, right? A type of bound that looks like a Chernoff-Hofding bound, right? And there are many different ways in which these bounds are stated, right? There are many different variations for these bounds, and these variants are useful in various different places, right? Depending on your application or where you're going to apply it, some statement of this bound is much easier to apply than another statement of the bound, right? We will see we will see a proof where we stop at the most crude form of the bound, and then we will state some very specific and very nice versions of this bound that we can use specifically for our analysis. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so the way in which Chernoff-like bounds, right? Chernoff-Hofding type bounds, like bounds, they all start off in the same place. Okay, they start off by looking at what is known as the moment generating function. Okay, they all start here, and then they deviate based on assumptions about the properties of the random variables and other assumptions in the analysis based on what sort of bound that you need, whether you need a very tight bound, whether you're okay with slightly loose bounds, and so on. That comes much later. but most of them start this notion of what is known as a moment generating function. Right? So what is a moment generating function? So you look at, so let x be a random variable. You look at this function e power tx, okay, where t is some parameter. Correct. And e power tx is nothing but summation. If you just expand out e power tx, this is t power I divided by I factorial times x power I, right? I greater than or equal to 0. And this function is called the moment generating function because if you take the expected value of e power tx, right, this is the generating function for the moments of the random variable, right? Recall that I said the moment is basically x power I, x power I, right? So what you are going to get is a generating function for the moments of the random variable, right? The expectation of x power I, that is the ith moment, right? The first moment is basically the standard, the mean, right? And then you have higher moments. And e power tx, expectation of e power tx gives you the generating function for the moments of the random variable, right? So that's why it's called the moment generating function. And all the bounds, these Chernoff-Hovding bounds and even stronger bounds, most of them start off by looking and analyzing the moment generating function, right? So let's start in that same way, right? So let t be some parameter. We'll fix this is fixed later. Right? What we are interested in is this probability that x is going to be greater than some m, right? Or in both ways. So let's start with this. So we are just looking at one part of the bound, right? So what's the probability that x is greater than m? This is same as the probability that e power tx is greater than e power tm, right? At this point, you know that e power tx is a non-negative random variable. Right? And so you use Markov and you say that this is at most the expected value of e power tx divided by e power tm. Right? And now what we are going to do is we are going to analyze this quantity, right? E power tx. And so let's, so you know that, so in our specific case, you know that x is summation xi, I going from 1 to n. So the expected value of e power tx is the expected value of e power t summation xi this is nothing but the expectation of the product, right? E power t xi I going from 1 to n, right? At this point, you know that xi's are independent, right? Since xi's are independent, you can write this as the product of expectation of e power txi, right? And what is the expectation of e power txi? You know that probability of xi is equal to 1 is pi, right? So this is the product of I from 1 to n. Pi into e power t plus 1 minus pi, right? So this is nothing but I going from 1 to n pi times e power t minus 1 plus 1. Yeah. Any questions so far? Any clarification so far? Okay. So now what you do is the following. So what you're going to do now is you want to look at, so this is expectation of e power tx, right? And what you use is this inequality known as the arithmetic mean geometric mean inequality, which tells you that this is at most summation pi e power t minus 1 plus 1 divided by n, I going from 1 to n, the whole power n. Okay. Now notice that this is when is the arithmetic geometric mean inequality and inequality and equality?
When every term is equal.
Yeah, when every term is equal. So that basically means this, there is equality here when xi's are Bernoulli random variables of the same parameter, right? Or rather when x is a binomial distribution. Right, this inequality becomes an equality, becomes very strict when exactly when x is the binomial distribution, right? Yeah. So now what you do is yeah, so you look at this quantity, you define, you define p to be summation pi by n. Okay. Right, and q to be the quantity 1 minus p, sorry, ah, right? So what you can now write, so recall that we wanted to look at this quantity, right? What we said, that probability of, let me just take that, right? This is what we were writing, right? This is what we were analyzing, right? So now you can use, let's set so what is n times p? N times p is basically the expected value of x, right? Because it is summation of pi's, right? So what we want is the probability that x is greater than, what is the chance that x is greater than some, it is some a little farther away from the expectation. What is the probability that x is greater than p plus r times n, right? Where pn is the expectation of x. This probability is bounded by e power expectation of e power tx by e power t n into p plus r, right? And this is at most what we have just gotten here. So we know that p is this p summation pi by n. So this is nothing but e power t, p into e power t plus q by e power t into p plus r, the whole raised to n. Okay, this is just the algebra at this point. Okay, and typically what happens at this stage in all the proof is basically you try to, so notice that t is some parameter that is with us, right? T is a parameter that we have to choose. R times n is what we are looking at. This is the deviation that we want to bound, right? This is the deviation, and this is a parameter that is of our choice. So now what you typically do is you try to optimize. You say, what is, how small can it be? What is the value of t for which this is small enough, and so on, right? And or rather what is the parameter for which it is small enough, and simplify this quantity, right? How small can you make it? And typically what you get is with all the simplification, which I will give you the reference, you can read it if you want, but you get something like this, right? Which is highly complicated to use in any direct way, right? What you get is something like P divided by P plus T raised to P plus T, Q divided by Q minus T raised to Q minus T, the whole power n. Okay. So at this point, so this is sort of like the strongest way in which you can write. We have hardly used any sort of approximation till now, right? We have mostly been very strict with our approximations and so on, right? Because the AMGM inequality at this point is probably one place where we have used an inequality, and that is strict when X is a binomial distribution and so on. So we have been mostly been very strict with whatever we have done. It is at this point that you will have different versions based on how we are going to approximate this and so on. Okay. So we will not see the various version how they are derived from here. I'll give you the references to read it, but I'll just state the version, a few versions of the Chernoff bounds that we are going to be useful for us. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So let's state the theorem now, right? Let's state the way in which this theorem is going to be useful for us. Okay. This, what you're going to write now is called Chernoff bounds. Hoeffding's bound is a slightly more generalized version of this, which the proof again goes in the same way. It is again going to construct these moment generating functions and simplify it and so on. But let's state the theorem because this is what is going to be most useful. At least for now, you can read the proof in the books that I give you as reference, but let's state the theorem and try to understand, because this statement here is not very useful to apply directly, right? No one ever applies this directly. Okay. So let's see one version of the Chernoff bound that will be useful for us. So let x1, x2 up till xn be independent indicator random variables with the probability that xi is equal to 1 equal to pi, right? And let x be the sum of these random variables. Okay. Then for every, so that then this is what we'll write. Then the first statement is that so these are multiple versions. For every t greater than 0, right, the probability that absolute value of x minus e of x is greater than t is at most e to the minus 2t square divided by n. Okay. So again, it's so notice that the bound that you have here is sort of, there is an exponential term that is sitting in here, right? And typically you want to say, so if expectation is it will be summation of pi's, right? Let's look at the case when these pi's are all the same, right? Then the expectation is np, and t will be something like some epsilon np or something, right? How far further away, 1 plus epsilon times pn, how far away from the expectation is the random variable, right? And for instance, if you want to say something like right, if pi's are all equal, say pi's are all equal, then your expectation of x is nothing but n times p. And if you take t to be slightly more than, say it is just 1 plus epsilon times np, right? If you want to know whether it is just so much far, right, whether it is very close to the expectation, it is slightly off, then what you have here is something like e power, this would be something like e power minus 2 into 1 plus epsilon the whole square n squared p square by n. So the n goes off, and then you have something like an exponential term sitting in here, right? So this bound is a very strong bound. It's the error probability, the deviation, the probability that the random variable deviates from the expectation is, as you go farther and farther away, that probability goes down exponentially, right? That is the crucial part of these bounds. Correct? This is one version that is sometimes useful. The There is also these other versions where you can separately talk about the deviation going in one side and the other side, right? So for in this case, what you have is for every epsilon greater than 0, the probability that x is greater than 1 plus epsilon times expectation of x, right? So you want to say that what is the probability that it is just slightly more than expectation plus some epsilon times expectation, right? If it's, what is this probability? This is at most e to the minus epsilon squared expectation of x divided by 3, right? And similarly on the other side, the probability that x is less than 1 minus epsilon into expectation of x is also small. It is e to the minus epsilon square e of x divided by 2. Right? So there is this small difference between these constants that comes out of the way in which you can approximate this, right? So you get these bounds by taking this and then suitably approximating it for different values of r and t and so on. And depending on these approximations, what you get is the slightly asymmetrical bound, right? Is this clear? Any questions regarding this statement? Right? These are just one set of statements. There could be multiple. There are multiple different ways in which you can state Chernoff bounds. Right? There are many different versions. I'll give some of them as exercises also. Some of them you will see in the book also. Right? So this is just one couple of versions which will be useful. Okay. So now, similar to Chernoff, with a slightly more generalized version is what is sometimes known as Hofding's bound. Right. So Hofding's bound. So notice the Chernoff bound works for independent indicator random variables. Right. They take value 0 and 1, and they are Bernoulli random variables. Right. So Hofding's bound is slightly more general. So let x1, x2, and so on till xn be independent random variables that take value in the interval 0, 1, right? In the real interval 0, 1, rather than being indicator random variables, or rather a, b, in the interval a comma b, okay? Such that the expected value of xi, right, is equal to say mu. Okay. Then what you can say is that the probability that 1 over n summation xi, okay, this is farther away, right? This is close to mu. The probability that this is greater than epsilon is at most 2 times e to the minus 2n epsilon squared divided by b minus a the whole squared. Right? So notice that here, if you take x to be the random variable, which is like an average, 1 over n I equal to 1 to n xi, then expectation of x is 1 over n times mu, right, which is equal to mu. Right? So it's for basically this quantity here is this random variable x, and this is expectation of x. Right? So these different versions are useful in different settings depending on what is it that you're analyzing. Right? So all of them have a similar sort of proof. They all go via the moment generating functions, but they all deviate based on what approximations that you use. After you get this, once you reach this statement of this most crude form of the bound, then they all deviate based on how we are going to approximate these bounds. Right? So some of them are stronger, some of them are weaker, some of them are more useful. In some settings, one bound is maybe slightly weaker, but it will be more useful. Right? All of them will give you some sort of an exponential bound, but some of them are more useful more useful in a certain scenario than other bounds. And that knowing when to apply what is, just comes by practice and comparing some sort of a pattern matching and so on. Right?
So
Yeah.
So in that the crude form,
Yeah.
like from what we finally got to that crude form, how exactly are we going from there to here?
So this amounts to simplifying this quantity. This will be you're looking at how small that this value can be. You're going to do some sort of a calculus and see how small can this value get.
Like, are we optimizing for R there?
Uh, Let me just see. So we
Like,
will look at the parameter t for which this is minimized, and for that value and so on. So that is how typically we go.
sir, but in the crude form bound also T comes up.
Uh,
Like, and it's that form we obtained is like monotonic in R, right?
which one?
The one we obtained, P e power T plus Q divided by e power T into P plus R
Yeah,
whole power. That is monotonic in R.
yeah,
And in the crude form also T comes up as a parameter.
yeah.
So
So
like
you
I was just thinking how what they've optimized it.
okay? So maybe I'll give you the. You can look at the reference that is there. So it's basically you're trying to. So maybe I don't know whether I wrote it correctly. Just let me just see whether I wrote it correctly. Just a minute. Okay, maybe I wrote it wrong. That's what this R is. These things should be same, I think. Let me just see. Let me just. Maybe I wrote it wrong. Yeah, these must be same. I'm sorry. You're correct. You're talking about this thing. It'll be something like this. No, no, wait, wait. This is R only. Right. So now what you want to do is you want to choose a value for t that is going to minimize this quantity here. That is what is going to happen. And based on that is what you have, what the bound that you have here. Oh, wait a minute. I think I wrote something. Missed. No, no, no. So I'm sorry. These are not t. These are r. These are r, I think. Okay. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. You're right. Okay. Because r has to come somewhere here. It cannot be t alone. Does that make
Yes, sir.
sense? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
What I wrote is wrong. Yeah. R has to come somewhere there. So you minimize for this for so you look at what value of t where for which this gets minimized, right? That you use your standard calculus also. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Good point. Okay, so we'll see some simple applications for application of this Chernoff bounds directly right now, and then we will see. Then we'll look at. So currently, we have mostly been looking at basic probabilistic tools and so on. Then we look at more specific problems as we go further in the course, right? So one thing that we can directly apply here is let's look at again probability amplification. Right, let's go to probability amplification. Right, let's look at probability amplification. But now let's look at what are called two-sided error algorithms. Okay, these are a very common. We haven't seen any specific two-sided error algorithms so on till now. But two-sided error algorithms are the following, right? So they do the following. So you have a problem, and the error can happen in both sides in the sense that even in the yes instance, the algorithm can say a no. For a no instance, also the algorithm can say, and then the no instance, the algorithm can say yes with some probability. Right? So it can make an error in both situations. in the case of identity testing or Frival's algorithm, we notice that there is only error on one side, right? If the polynomial is identically zero, then the algorithm never makes a mistake. Similarly, if the product, right, while verifying the metrics, the product of matrix multiplication, if AB is equal to C, then again the algorithm never makes a mistake. It's only in one side that the algorithm makes a mistake. But we will see as we go along, we'll see algorithms that will make mistakes on both sides, right? Even when, say, even in the case of yes instance, it might sometimes say a no. In the case of a no, it might sometimes say a yes, right? And say that you have the following, right? So you have an algorithm, right, such that the probability that A on X is wrong is say less than 1 over 3, right? There is a small probability that A makes a mistake on X, right? X, where X is the input. You have the input, and the probability that it makes an error is at most 1 over 3. Okay. So in this case, so it's success probability. So the probability that A of X is correct is at least 2/3. Okay. In this case, you actually need the error to be greater than half. If the error is not greater than half, you probably can't do much. Right? You will not be able to amplify the probability a lot. So the probability has to be strictly greater than half. Okay. So now, if you think about how to amplify, right? In the case of one-sided error algorithm, what we did was, say, in the case of identity testing, what we said is we'll repeat it k times. If it says it's identically zero all k times, then we will say it is identically zero. Otherwise, we'll say it is not identically zero. Right? And then that was sufficient, right? Even if once it says it's not identically zero, it is fine. Right? So what do you do here when you have error on both sides? Is it sufficient to just say that if you make one mistake, or if you say it is correct once, then I'll accept it, and if you say wrong all the times, you will reject it? So how do you amplify such an algorithm? What is the way to do it? So you want to improve this probability bounds. You want to take this and say that the probability that A of X is wrong, you want this to be less than, say, 1 over 2 power n. Okay, you want to make this very, very tiny. Yeah. So as Pragyan says, what you do is you repeat and try to take the majority answer. We should apply Bayes' theorem and see which is more likely after multiple runs. So no, as an algorithm, what will you do, right? I mean, you say you repeat it, you have to say yes or no. When do you say yes or no is the question, right? With repetition, if probability increases, can you just clarify? So Sartha, can you clarify? I didn't understand what you said exactly. To give a confidence bound the idea. Okay. And Indranil, what is it that you said? I didn't understand that clearly. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do is so as Pragyan already said, and what we will do is to basically take the majority, right? So the Bayes theorem idea, I don't know exactly what you meant there. I don't fully understand that. Maybe we can discuss that later. But the simplest thing that you can do is to basically take a majority, right? So here is what you do to amplify, right? What you do is run A of X on run A of X, say k times. This is not working. With independent random strings and output the majority answer. Right? And how do you analyze this? Why is this correct, right? So what you do is to analyze this, what you want to say is that if you run a of x k times, what is the expected number of mistakes that might appear? How many of these runs will you expect to be wrong? If you run ax k times with independent random strings, how many on, right? K over 3, right? Because so to say this, right? Yeah, k over 3. So to say this, what you can do, if you want to write formally, you can say that you can define these indicator random variables xi, which is 1 if the ith uh, iteration of a of ax is wrong, right? And it is 0 otherwise. You can define these random variables that captures whether the ith iteration is correct or wrong, right? And then what you basically say is the following, right? You say that so you're interested in this quantity x, which is summation xi, right? X measures the number of iterations where you get a wrong answer, correct? And according to our algorithm, we want to make sure that we want to say bound this probability that x is greater than k over 2. We want to upper bound this, right? Because you want to say that you're unlikely that majority of the answers will be wrong, right? As long as that is true, uh, as long as that happens, you will not say a wrong answer, right? So this is what you want to bound. Now expectation of x is summation I equal to 1 to n expectation of xi, and this is nothing but the probability that a of x is wrong, right? So this is at most k over 3. Sorry, how much I repeated it k times, it's all k. Right? So expectation of x is less than k over 3. So if you notice, you have a random variable. Say if you take this random variable, right? The x is represented here. What you know is that expectation is somewhere here. It is less than, this is k over 3. Okay? And say here is k over 2. Right? So this is where the expectation is somewhere here. Right? Expectation is sitting somewhere here. How likely is it that random variable will jump all the way from here to somewhere here, right? There is so much gap here between k over 3 and k over 2, and you know that the expected value is less than k over 3. How likely is it that your random variable is going to be much more than k over 2, right? Much is more than k over 2. Yeah. Okay, so Sarthak has said something. Maybe I'll just come back to that after I finish this. All right. Yeah. So this is what we have, and so what we are interested in is the probability that um, x is greater than k over 2, right? So this is same as the probability that x is greater than, how do I write it? It is 1 plus, I want to write it in the form of 1 plus epsilon times, say, k by 3. I want to write it as k over 2. So epsilon would be what? This would be how much would that be? It will be 1 minus so k over 3 minus 2k over 3, right? Or no. Let me just write it. I think my notes I have written slightly differently. So 1 minus, sorry, 1 plus, you want 1 plus epsilon k over 3 to be something like k over 2, right? So 1 plus epsilon should be 3 over 2. Epsilon should be 1 over 2. Oh, is it? Sorry. Okay, so you want something like this, right? So your epsilon, to apply your Chernoff bound, epsilon should be equal to 1 over 2. And now you can apply your any version of Chernoff bound that you want, which is, where is it? Right. Say for instance, you can apply this bound here, right? This says that probability that x is greater than 1 plus epsilon ex is something small here. So what you have is, this is at most e power minus epsilon square is 1 over 4 times k over 3 times 1 over 3, I think, right? Yeah. Right. So this is e power minus k divided by 36. Correct? So now if you repeat it sufficiently large number of times, this can be made very small, right? You repeat it sufficiently large number of times, then this probability can be made sufficiently small, right? So the algorithm, so if you want an inverse, for instance, if you want an inverse exponential error, right? If you want inverse exponential error, then you choose k to be something like, say, n, right? So you repeat it n times. Initially, if it has, if it has running time of tn or something, you repeat it sufficient number of times, and this bound can be made exponentially small, right? So if you choose k is equal to n, what you have here is something like e to the minus n over 36, right? Which is very small. So you repeat it sufficiently, and unlike these other bounds of Chebyshev or Markov, the drop in the error probability is much faster, right? It's exponentially small, right? That is what you see. Is this clear? Is this part clear? Right. Once again, you can ask things like whether you need independent random coins, whether you can reuse randomness, and so on. But notice that we need to significantly change the analysis, right? I mean, if you remove independence, for instance, Chernoff does not work anymore, right? Independence was crucial in the in Chernoff bounds, where when you went from this part to this part here, right? For instance, this jump here required independence. So if we are going to take, say, instead of independent random variables, say you're going to take pairwise independent random variables and so on, then instead of this equality, you will get something slightly different. But you still have Chernoff-like bounds for different random variables which are not completely independent. For dependent settings also, you have some similar bounds, just that it will become slightly weaker, right? So many of these equalities will become inequalities because you'll have to approximate and so on. Okay, we will see. Maybe I will give a few exercises in a couple of days where you can try it out. But yeah, that we will see. Yeah. So I'll go back to what Sarthak was saying. So let me just go over that. Okay. So I agree that is there, but what we actually want is, you want an algorithm that at the end you can really guarantee and say that this is what is going to happen, right? So you can find a postulator to give confidence in our results. Okay. Okay, but what you're saying, so that will not be sufficient to give a confidence bound as to how. So what you want is that you have this algorithm, and you want to say that there is always a guarantee that this algorithm will perform at least up to this level of error, right? So that does not follow directly from what you're saying, right? Or does it? Maybe I didn't understand exactly what is it that you're saying. Okay, okay. Right. So what we want here at least is to say that you give an algorithm, and what you want to say is that what is the guarantee that you can give for this algorithm, right? So more than so I think I slightly understand what you're saying, but I don't see directly how that will give a guarantee for the algorithm that we have just designed. Right? Yeah. Okay. Maybe we'll discuss that again. Yeah. So any other questions? I think we'll have to stop now. I don't think I have time to start the next part. Okay, I think we will stop here, right? So I think this also concludes the first module of the course, right? Next, what we will do is I think it is there on the course page also. What we're going to look at this balls and bins paradigms, which is related to hashing, and then we will see various different hashing techniques and various different hashing algorithms, different applications in different scenarios, right? So we are going to see hashing and balls and bins. That is what is the next module about. And the part that we have developed so far, we will be using all of these in analyzing the algorithms that come up there. Okay, so that is what we are going to start off with next week. Monday we will spend on going over the problem set, and then Wednesday we will start with the next module. Okay. Any questions? So I don't know, have all of you actually updated the sheet on the course reading part? I don't know how many of you have done. I have to check. Yesterday evening, I saw that many of you have not updated that. So please update that by the end of this week, right? And maybe next week or the week after that, we'll have an initial meeting regarding that, regarding the paper reading. Okay, so please update it by the end of this week if you have not done so already. Okay. So that's all that I want to say. Any other clarifications? Any logistical thing that you want to talk about? So when you say probabilistic method, which one do you mean? What do you mean? So whatever I have given right now, I will give you references. I mean, I haven't updated it, but these references definitely I will update on the course page. Right. So probabilistic method. So the randomized algorithm that we are teaching, I'm mostly following the book by Mitzenmacher and Upfal, and with a few other references that I will tell you. I'll update the course page by the end of the day. Right. So you will get it there. Yeah. Anything else?
Sir, in this case that we are doing the probability amplification,
Yeah.
like we have all indicator variables have the same PI, right?
Yeah.
And like, so can we get like a better bound than the Chernov's one that we saw?
In this case, I think Chernoff will probably give you the best. I mean, exponential growth is probably the best that you will get. Right. I mean, this is sort of like the best that you can get. Asymptotically, this is probably the best that you will get.
Okay.
Right. But some of the other analysis related that we did before, like coupon collector and so on, there are analysis that will give you better bounds, right? Where you didn't have exponential bounds, where you had inverse polynomial and so on. There, I think you can actually improve based on with a different analysis. Here, I don't think you can get anything better. Exponential is probably the best that you will get. Right. So this is probably the best.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. So you mean to say, can you use a different, or are you saying, do you want to use a different version of the Chernoff bound and to get slightly better constants and so on? Is that what you're saying? You don't care about the asymptotics, but the constants involved and so on. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that also I was asking you.
Yeah. Okay. That might be possible, right? So there might be different bounds that you can use, which will give you slightly better things. Sure, that is possible, right? Better constants and so on. That is definitely possible. I don't know the answer right now, but it depends. I mean, there are so many different versions, so it is possible that the constants can become better, right? Asymptotics might not be good, but it might remain the same, but the constants can be made better. Yeah, that is possible, definitely. Anything else? Okay, so then let's wrap up for today and let's meet on Monday. Right? Okay, thank you.